First of all, I'm very happy to be back at CopyCamp. I attended my first CopyCamp in 2014, and since then, this community has really helped a lot in bringing some of our demands and our issues with the copyright reform on the agenda. I do think we have achieved a lot, but at the same time, we also run the risk of taking a huge step back with the copyright reform that is currently being discussed in the European Union if things go wrong, if we don't manage to make our voices heard. And this is why I'm talking about the copyright showdown. So we've worked on this copyright reform for over a year, but now we are really entering the hot phase where it's going to be decided whether at the end of the day we can say that this has been worthwhile and that as Europeans we end up with a better copyright reform and not having taken another step back. And there are some good elements of the copyright reform that I will not focus on today, but rather on the bad parts that we really need to prevent in order to make sure that this is worthwhile and is a step in the right direction. This showdown about the EU copyright reform is coming up around the end of this year. So we are really in the 2 or 3 months leading up to the most important votes and the most important decisions being made. And if we want to have an influence on those decisions, then we need to have a clear story to tell of what is at risk and what are the problems that we are trying to avoid. And I think there are two sides to this story. One of the side is how we look at it as internet activists and as internet users. And for us, I think it's relatively easy to understand why this copyright proposal is a problem. And there are two elements of this proposal, which I will not explain in detail, but if you stay around for the following sessions, we're going to have talks by Diego, by Till, by Diana, who are going to go into the detail of what these proposals mean and what the problems are for different parts of the open knowledge ecosystem, for open science, for internet users, and so on. But at the heart of it, these two proposals are touching upon the very basic elements of participation on the internet. On the one hand, the free uploading and hosting of files on the internet and being able to use other people's services to upload your videos, your pictures, your texts, and so on. And on the other hand, the technique of hyperlinking, which is how we communicate and how we are able to participate on the internet. These two very basic actions of online participation would get restricted by the copyright proposal. There is Article 11, which is an obligation to pay a license fee or license the linking to newspaper articles on the internet. And there's Article 13, which would put an obligation on internet platforms to install filters to automatically monitor the activities of users to prevent copyright infringement before it even happens and to face liability if they fail to do so. And of course, if this happens, this will have effects not just on our private lives of how we use the internet, but also on our activism. Getting audiences for our own messages will be a lot harder if the internet platforms we use are not open to everybody's participation and are filtered from some kind of centralized source, and when the sharing of information and linking between different messages gets harder. So this would be basically a step back into the TV age of communication, where there is a one-to-many communication and it's much harder for an activist to make their voices heard. And these upload filters and also the laws against sharing links to news content will have chilling effects on online participation and undermine what makes the internet so unique, which is that it's a many-to-many form of communication. And I think for us this is reason enough to make sure this doesn't happen. But, of course, we don't have to convince ourselves, we have to convince politicians. And not everything that sounds like a compelling message and a compelling story to tell to us is necessarily something that is going to convince the people who sit in our parliament. So I've been getting a lot of emails recently, and I'm very happy about that, from citizens who are saying, this copyright reform is a problem, please stop these articles. However, they often just say, please don't destroy the internet. And you know, I don't want to destroy the internet. I think that's a message that works with me, but I have doubts whether it's going to work with my colleagues. because not everybody has grown up with the internet, not everybody has experience in using it firsthand, and as this being an important part of their own political history and political experience of being active. So in order to win this fight, we need to speak in the language of the politicians we're trying to address and to hijack the narratives that are going on. And how we can do this? Today, the European leaders, the heads of states, the heads of government, are all meeting in Tallinn in Estonia to, for the first time, have a digital summit. This is really a new thing, that digital policy has this high point on the political agenda. And if you listen to the messages that they're sending, it is all about, it's all hand-wringing about Google and Facebook. And in some cases, they have a point with this. So if they're talking about taxation policy and making sure that multinational companies are being taxed and that this problem is bigger in the area of online companies, I think this is an important point that they raise. But it doesn't stop there. It's generally there is a fear that the European internet companies are falling behind, and that the control over the internet as a public space is being handed over to a few multinational corporations. And I think this is something that we need to address. So I think it's important, if you are communicating to politicians about why filters are bad or why this obligation is bad, to frame it in those terms, to explain, okay, who would actually end up building these filters? If you want to filter for copyright infringing content, you need two things. On the one hand, you need a lot of money to build these filters, and on the other hand, you need access to the right holder data. So you need to know which content is actually protected by copyright and who holds the rights. And ironically, we as the state, as a public body, are not actually allowed to build this database, because there is a requirement not to have formalities for the protection of copyright. So who actually has this information? On the one hand, the big media companies themselves, so the music industry, usually have this rights holder information about their own repertoires, and Google, who has basically built a private system of copyright registration through Content ID. So it's pretty easy to understand that if these filters become mandatory, it would probably end up being the music industry, the big media companies, and companies like Google and Facebook, who are the only ones who have the money and the access to information to actually build these filters. And we would end up all our European companies having to license those filters, and all our content basically being filtered through the servers that we don't have any control over. And I think this is an argument that might resonate with politicians who are not so concerned about the fundamental rights aspect of filters and don't want them in the first place, but we explain to them that this would actually hand away power from those that they want to strengthen. And it's similar when you're looking at the question of charging for linking to newspapers. This is something that is coming from a few large publishing houses, especially in Germany. But the goal is somehow to make sure that these companies get more money. But of course, the end result will be that whoever charges for linking to their news article will not be linked to as much. And today we're having a huge discussion in the European Union around issues such as fake news. And I think you can be relatively sure that fake news sites or state-funded propaganda sites are never going to charge you for linking to them. So it's relatively easy to understand who is going to have the larger audience if such a law is passed. So the situation in the European Parliament and the Council is now that we are entering the hot phase. Both of these bodies, who together have to decide on this law proposal, are in the middle of negotiations. And in the European Parliament, the situation in the last year has developed in quite a bad direction. There have been several committees that have already voted on opinions that have generally not been helpful. And the lead negotiating group, the European People's Party, has replaced their rapporteur, the responsible person negotiating this, who had actually spent 3 years learning all about copyright, talking to academics, and coming up with a pretty reasoned opinion, and then replaced her with somebody else who is completely new to the topic and therefore is basically following the official party line, which is that the proposal on the table is fine and we should more or less just accept it. The good news is that this change in the leadership in Parliament means that we have a bit more time to mobilize. The new rapporteur, Axel Voss, is a German, and I have the impression that he doesn't want to make any very strong decisions on anything until the new German government has formed, which is probably not going to happen until December. So the official date of the vote of 10th of October is already off the table. We are going to have more time to work on this and to build up our campaign. But this big vote is coming up sooner or later. It might be at the beginning of December, most likely. And if we were to vote on the link tax, on this issue of the neighboring right for publishers today, my expectation would be that we would end up in a stalemate, that we would have more or less 50% of the members in the committee in favor and 50% against. And we might end up in a situation where it's the neo-Nazis from the ENF who would have the decisive vote. And I don't think this is a situation we want to put ourselves in. So it's our responsibility now to tip the scale and to make sure that these proposals will be rejected. The second chamber that is responsible for negotiating this is a lot more obscure. In the council you have the national governments who are supposed to come up with their own amendments and their own version of this directive, and we generally know a lot less about what their positions are. You don't have this public amendment process that you have in the parliament. But recently we have learned quite a lot about what the thinking is there, because 6 countries have actually asked a bunch of legal questions about the filtering obligation, and these questions are more or less telling you that they would like to outright reject this idea. They are basically questioning whether this is compatible with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and if you have a government saying, I don't think this is in line with fundamental rights, then you're probably onto something. So these 6 countries are Belgium, the Netherlands, Finland, Ireland, Czech Republic and Hungary. These are the defenders of fundamental rights in the copyright reform. It's quite an interesting coalition, but what you can see is that there are a lot of countries that are not on this list. And so you may want to contact your government and ask them publicly, why have these questions not been asked by the Polish government? Why have they not been asked by the Austrian government? Why is Estonia, as the council presidency, not following these concerns? There has also been a separate initiative, some separate questions asked by Germany, and they are not quite as critical of the proposal as these other 6 countries. But of course, Germany is a very large country, and them asking some critical question is a huge win for us. And if you look at what these questions are, you also see that some of our messages have been getting through. So for example, Germany is asking now, what will this filtering obligation mean for open access repositories run by universities? They are internet platforms where users can upload content. Does that mean that they are now in the same category as YouTube and Facebook and have to install these filters? I think this is a very good question, but I think what it also tells us is that different governments have different things that they care about. And Germany has just gone through the process of having a reform of its copyright for the sciences. So I think a good strategy is to look at, what does your government care about? Do they care about startups, for example? Then confront them with what the startups are saying about it. Do they care about education? Do they care about fundamental rights? And confront them with the arguments against these proposals that fit their narrative and their priorities. On the side outside of the Parliament and the Council, we have a lot of campaigns, and I think this is a great thing. And if any of you are part of organizing these campaigns, then thanks a lot to you, because this is really how we manage to get the word out. We have several campaigns that allow you to call your MEPs and to directly contact them with messages. You have the Mozilla Change Copyright campaign, which is one of the sources where a lot of the emails are coming from at the moment. You have the Save the Link campaign by Open Media. You have Save the Meme by Bits of Freedom. Save the Link focusing more on the news snippets issue, and Save the Meme focusing more on the filtering. And you also have petitions and other initiatives from different stakeholder groups. So Copy Fighters is harnessing the voices of young people, and they will have a talk later today. You have Safe Code Share, which is addressing how this proposal would affect platforms such as GitHub that, of course, have lots of third-party content hosted, but don't really have a big copyright problem. And you have the Right Copyright campaign, which is focusing on the impact on education. The only complaint I would have here is that it's a bit fragmented. We have a lot of really good different campaigns, but we need to think about and discuss how we can tie all of them together for the last final push. One thing that I would like to encourage you to intensify is some of the open letters that have been sent by stakeholders that are hard to argue with when they say something. So we have already seen in Council that, for example, Germany has picked up this point that the open science community led by Spark Europe has been making, that Article 13, the filtering, will be bad for open science. You have leading IP academics that have written open letters led by Create, which is also, you know, if you have all the leading IP institutes at different universities telling you that this is just bad legal drafting, this will have an impact, at least with some people who are working on this. You have Stop the Censorship Machine by digital rights organizations, and there you can really see that this idea that content filters are censorship at the end of the day is really resonating and is increasingly also resonating in the press. And you have Allied for Startups, which I think are making important messages for those countries who pay lip service to supporting startups. And you even have publishers associations now saying the large publishers do not speak for us. We don't want this link tax. It has actually been harmful to us where it has been tried. So where do we go from there? I think some of the lessons we can learn from the campaign so far is that a lot of the members of the European Parliament, especially the ones who are in the Legal Affairs Committee, have already heard about the copyright reform. They know it's a contentious topic, and the more we talk to them, they will feel forced to take a position on it. And this is very important, especially among the Social Democrats and the Liberals, where in both cases you have somebody who is negotiating for them. In the cases of the Social Democrats, you have Lydia Geringer, who is very supportive of a copyright reform that is in the interest of users and in the interest of open knowledge, but she is facing a lot of pushback from other members of her group. And you have the exact opposite among the Liberals, where you would think, well, Liberals would probably be in favor of startups and so on, but they actually have taken the most conservative position on copyright possible, simply because their negotiator holds those personal opinions. So there it's extremely important to activate individual members of those groups and to make sure that they push in the right direction. In all of this, our blind spot is still the Council to some extent, where the national governments negotiate. Some messages, such as the message about open science, have been getting through to them, but there's still relatively little targeted campaigning. If you look at those campaigns that I've mentioned earlier, most of them are in one way or another aimed at the Parliament and not at the Council. So my message to you today is that we really need to do more about the Council, and we can do this by raising awareness of this copyright reform locally. The pressure is built at the national level in the media, and it's the right time now to get your local press interest and to get the local government on record about what their position is. Recently, this has worked a little bit in Estonia, where the Estonian government has this image of being super digital friendly, but has put out proposals that would really be harmful to the internet ecosystem. And there has been some media attention to that in the Estonian press that people in Brussels then tell me about. This is something that we can replicate in other countries. Your job is to make sure that these kinds of open letters that exist at a European level also happen at national level, that you make sure that your digital rights organizations, your tech organizations, your universities get active and talk about these topics in the media and talk to your national governments. it's useful to reach out to local tech blogs. We've been successful in some cases to have certain messages been picked up. So, for example, just last week about a copyright study by the European Commission that did not really support their proposals, and make sure that these issues are picked up in the tech blogs, in the tech reporting in your national countries and in your languages. This will not just target the council, it will raise the issue to the attention of your national governments, but of course it has the good side effect that the members of parliament from your country will also be paying attention to the national press, perhaps even more than what is happening at the European level. So my job in the European Parliament is going to continue to be to feed you with all the information you need for your national campaigns about what the status of the reform is, when we are likely to vote, which is a constantly moving target, and which messages, which people in the Parliament, in the Council you should target. I have an active network of people who translate campaign material that we produce. Yesterday we published a blog post about why filters fail and why they're a terrible tool for regulating the internet. If you want to replicate this in your national language, you're very welcome to do so. It's all under free licenses for you to reuse. And I hope that you can pick this up and that you can make it a topic in your own national press, in your own national debates, that the politicians from your country cannot escape. Thank you.